finally, another thing that gives you a sense of the way in which military expenditures became very, very important in post-war California might be this. You start with John Bean. There's a Bean Avenue or Bean Street in Los Gatos. It's named after him. He basically, in 1884, founded the John Bean Spray Pump Company. And there's on the right, that's him on the left, and there's his spray pump. And then there was a factory that made that stuff from him. In addition, remember, Santa Clara Valley at that point in the 18th century, 1800s, was a prune company. The Anderson Prune Dipper Company made a whole bunch of different kinds of things. They made power graders and prune dippers and dipping baskets and all of this kind of stuff. General line, packers and dryers supply. So you had the Bean Company and the Anderson Company, basically making at the end of the 19th century machines that were used for food. Well, what happens is that the Anderson Company merges with the Barngrover Company, and they make a whole bunch of agricultural plants, and there's their plant in San Jose in 1920. And what happens is that eventually the Bean Company and the Anderson Barngrover Company merge, and they become Farm Food Machinery Corporation, FMC. And you probably remember that for a long time there was an FMC plant right on Coleman Avenue, fairly close to where Costco is right now, I think. And it was a huge kind of plant. And at the end, by the end of World War II and during the post-war era, FMC shifts its emphasis from farm stuff to other stuff. It started during World War II. They made these landing vehicles that were used in the Normandy invasion. They made all sorts of various military machinery. They made Sherman tanks. I remember when I moved out here and the FMC plant was there, the whole lot was filled with tanks. There was virtually not a farm or food machine to be found. So the evolution of FMC from food and farm to military stuff is emblematic of what happened, of the way in which California industry was so much dominated in the post-war era by military expenditures. That is the FMC plant being finally demolished to make room for the earthquake stadium, the San Jose Earthquake Stadium, a little bit few years ago. So the question is, where does this all leave us? And I think it's a good place as any. As opposed to the farm workers, which we talked about last time, and as opposed to immigration, which we're going to talk about next time, technology is still kind of an open-ended kind of question. There is no historiographical, consensus on technology. So maybe this segment from the NewsHour, from the PBS NewsHour, is as good a way as any to end our consideration.
Facebook and Google were in the crosshairs of lawmakers on Capitol Hill this week over their advertising policies and what happened with Russian interference in last year's election. In California, those tech giants are under scrutiny too, in part because of their expanding presence in Silicon Valley. Companies are often accused of dominating and changing the communities and housing markets where they are based. Special correspondent Spencer Michaels has our report. Facebook and Google were in the crosshairs of lawmakers on Capitol Hill this week over their advertising policies and what happened with Russian interference in last year's election. In California, those tech giants are under scrutiny too, in part because of their expanding presence in Silicon Valley. The companies are often accused of dominating and changing the communities and housing markets where they are based. Special correspondent Spencer Michaels has our report.
The fictional TV show Silicon Valley resorted to animation to visually depict the high-tech region stretching from San Francisco to San Jose. The real Silicon Valley, choked with traffic and lacking enough housing, doesn't need graphics to illustrate its problems as it tries to keep its suburban character while expanding and growing wealthier. A two-bedroom apartment here now rents from $3,500 to $4,500 a month. Google employs 20,000 workers in the town of Mountain View. It has plans to double or even triple its workforce, a move welcomed by some residents but feared by others like Jack Siegel, a retired engineer and former mayor.
It's just totally changing the nature of where we live for people, for the sake of Google employment, and for the developers who want to make a lot of money, and they do. It's becoming a town of apartment dwellers more than others. And example, look on the right here. There's 200 units of apartment buildings, and yet minimal parking and no infrastructure.
Part of Google's expansion is a new headquarters building adjacent to the dozens of buildings it acquired over the past 20 years. Google has also broken ground at nearby Moffett Field, leased from NASA, for another campus that includes housing.
We're growing every day. We're excited to be part of the lowest unemployment rate in the Bay Area.
Rebecca Prozon heads local government relations for Google.
I look forward to the conversation with Mr. Siegel, with the neighborhood, with the community to figure out what should the future look like.
But Siegel sees Google, which has inspired shopping centers, housing, buildings, and roads, turning Mountain View into a company town.
Yes, it is a company town in that it's controlled by whatever Google wants here, they pretty much get, and by the fact that developers want to support that as much as they can.
Are you going to essentially take over Mountain View?
No, we're not going to take over Mountain View. We want to be thoughtful and intentional about how we are in the community.
A so-called company town like Detroit can be dominated by one industry like automobiles, says Stanford law professor Michelle Wild Anderson, who has been studying tensions in Silicon Valley.
The anxiety about a company
Finish-
town
I'm almost
comes from
finished with
two
the second
things.
one.
One is a worry that we're going to over-rely on single companies or single industries, and that's kind of the Detroit fear. I think part of it is just the fear that Silicon Valley's people themselves will become a monoculture of tech workers.
One thing Google does want is more housing. It is pushing the city to approve 9,800 new units, some of them below market rate, though the city council wants to slash that number, fearing increased traffic.
If the 9,800 units are actually fulfilled and built, we will more than double the amount of affordable housing in Mountain View. So that wouldn't be just for employees.
Mountain View isn't the only city being transformed by tech. Facebook is increasingly dominating the towns of Menlo Park and its neighbor, East Palo Alto. With 5,500 workers, Facebook is well along with construction of a giant new office complex that will bring 12,000 new employees to the flourishing social network. But a future plan involves more than offices, says Public Policy Director Michael Matthews.
About half of that space will be for housing, 1,500 units, about 225 of that affordable housing. Retail space, grocery store, possibly a hotel, and some other things.
Matthews revealed to us a giant-scale model of Facebook's new Willow campus, surrounded by the quickly gentrifying neighborhoods of East Palo Alto and Bellhaven. Facebook has pledged $20 million to a community fund for housing and is trying to get foundations, companies, and nonprofits to raise another $55 million for affordable housing in a market where million-dollar homes are average. But getting Facebook's help wasn't easy, according to Tamika Bennett, who directs a community action nonprofit in East Palo Alto, which traditionally was home to low-income people and minorities.
We're a gentrifying city right now, unfortunately. So we have Google, we've got Facebook, we've got YouTube and LinkedIn. And
Bennett had to move to Oakland because East Palo Alto became too expensive, but she commutes back every day to fight to preserve her community.
we found out that Facebook was expanding once again. We did have to threaten lawsuit in order to get them to the table, but to Facebook's credit, they did decide to talk with us.
And we're open to listening to everybody and figuring out what makes sense. We're not adversarial about it.
But making sense in a dynamic economy is tough, says Stanford's Anderson.
People miss a more humble version of Silicon Valley. But the problem is that you can't have it both ways. We can't both allow all of this commercial development in these huge tech campuses and not permit the housing because it falls down hardest on lower paid workers.
She says high-tech companies need to explore building far outside the expensive metro areas, and they also have a responsibility.
In the modern condition of American inequality and lower paid workers and super concentrated wealth, do they have a moral obligation to start really trying to address some of our social problems? Yes. And most importantly, they have tremendous capacity to be part of the solution.
Google and Facebook are not the only players in the transformation of what used to be called the Valley of Heart's Delight. Now, Apple is building a giant building. Some call it the Death Star, some a spaceship, here in Cupertino. Apple declined our invitation to talk about what that means for the community. A few miles south, officials in San Jose, the second largest city in the state with 1.1 million residents, are welcoming high-tech development. Just beyond the skyline of San Jose's downtown, Google has proposed another 240-acre campus with 8 million square feet of offices to accommodate 20,000 workers, replacing a jumble of parking lots and small businesses. Sam Liccardo, San Jose's mayor, argues that his city is different than the smaller towns where Google and Facebook grew up.
The real problem with Silicon Valley's growth has been that those large companies have gone to the suburbs, and that has created the traffic mess. You know, we don't have those same concerns. We have the world headquarters for Adobe and Cisco and PayPal, and so we welcome the growth. Big cities are where large employers should be.
The transit hub will bring together commuter trains, Bay Area rapid transit, buses, a light rail system, and high-speed rail. In fact, some observers think workers could commute 100 miles or more from the Central Valley if the high-speed rail system ever gets built. But would 20,000 additional workers in a community with housing, grocery stores, hotels, and more constitute a company town?
Bring it on. We all would love to see another grocery store in downtown. We know our hotels are maxed out, so we need more hotel space. We know that small towns aren't going to welcome that. That's okay with us.
Meanwhile, Amazon is seeking to build another campus away from its base in Seattle, and the scramble among cities throughout the country to secure that plum is underway. I'm Spencer Michaels for the PBS NewsHour in Silicon Valley, California.
So, as I said, there's really no historiographical answer to this, but I think that video is a good way of summarizing the pluses and the challenges that this technology is bringing. So that's the end of number 2, and we will see you again with remote broadcast number 3, which will deal mainly with immigration and with a few other aspects of modern California.